So here's the selection process. Once we formed the committee, we established a deadline of August 1st for the submission of candidate articles. And because we had a short timeline, again, we basically restricted the submission of candidate articles to ourselves. So the members of the committee nominated articles to be included in this year's readings. That's going to change next year because next year starting strength coaches will have access to a link where they can nominate articles to us. And in fact, that is one of your responsibilities as a starting strength coach. No, you don't get any credit for it other than the knowledge that you did good, right? So that's one of your responsibilities as a starting strength coach. When you come across articles in the lay press or in the biomedical press, or in the exercise science press, and you say, hey, that's a really, and some of you already do this. I mean, I get pings from some of you all the time. It's like, hey, Sully, have you seen this? No, I haven't, thank you, right? That's one of your responsibilities, is to nominate articles that should be included in the readings or possibly in the science review. But this year, we restricted the nomination to ourselves, right? We looked at the scientific literature, we looked at articles from the SS site, we looked at popular press and website articles. The bunch of articles that we got nominated by the August 1st deadline underwent an initial triage by me. That's what they call it in granting and editorial. They underwent a triage. I just looked at them and just used my divine authority to say, no, we're not even going to look at those articles this year. Some of them got tabled for next year. And then every single one of the SSC Science Committee members had to read every single one of those articles and not just skim them. They had to read them in a thoughtful way, because then what they had to do is score them on a 5-point scale, right? Similar to what they do at the National Institutes of Health or the American Heart or other granting agencies, or on certain types of editorial boards. And we graded each article in 3 domains: relevance, readability, and reliability, right? So each article got scored in each one of those 3 domains on a 1 to 5 point scale, with 1 being like perfect and 5 being like just utter bullshit poison, right? So 5, you don't want to score a 5, you want to score a 1, right? And 2 is pretty good. 3 is, yeah, that might make it, and 4 and 5 is just totally right out. Make sense? Everyone understand that? And so then we averaged the scores and multiplied by 100, and so each basically the final score ranged from 100 to 500, right? With the highest score being the worst score. The scores were tabulated, and we basically established a cutoff, and that cutoff ended up being something like 214, I think it was. That ended up being the cutoff. And some of the articles scored very, very high, meaning very, very poorly, and they clearly were not going to be useful. And we had some articles that scored very high, and wait till I tell you which one scored the highest. And there was an article that we all kind of wanted to be included. We had a little bit of reservations about it, so we were going to make the cutoff 200, but we decided to make it 214, so you guys got an extra article. Woohoo. This ended up being 14 articles that got selected. That's probably a little bit high. The goal is going to be to select 10 to 15 articles a year for you guys, right, to read. It's totally a manageable amount of reading, but we do want to keep it under 15. Then the articles were assigned to the individual committee members to be abstracted, if necessary. Some of these articles are freely available on the web. You can just go pull them down. Anybody can get their hands on them. And those articles, we tended to place less importance on abstracting those articles, right? For example, some of the articles are from this Starting Strength website, because when it comes to relevance, readability, and reliability, you're just not going to do any better than articles posted on the Starting Strength website, right? They're certainly relevant, they're very readable, and they're very reliable, right? But certain articles, especially from the biomedical press, you're not going to be able to get your hands on. So what we did with those is what we do at national meetings, medicines, when we have medical board review meetings and stuff like that, when we want to talk about papers, somebody just abstracts the article. We write our own abstract of the article, not the author's abstract. We write our own abstract of the article, our own brief summary and evaluation of that article and its relevance. So the articles got farmed out to various members of the science committee, and they had to write their abstracts and get their abstracts back into me on time, which was just a couple of weeks ago, which they did because of the exercise with the bio sketches. So, and then also the science committee members had to write test questions. And those are the test questions that will go up in hopefully January of 2014 when this test becomes available for starting strength coaches on this. And that will end up being about 35 to 40 test questions, which you don't have to worry about because you've already passed this readings requirement. The articles and abstracts were compiled into the document that you have. Again, they'll be archived in the starting strength library. Next year, we'll have a longer lead time. We'll have more articles, not necessarily to deliver to you, but more articles to sift through. We'll be able to have more articles to look at to make sure that we get, and we'll have more articles from you guys. You guys will have more of an input into this process, the ability to nominate articles. So any SSC may and should nominate articles for review. So you can go to T-Nation, New York Times, HotNakedSquatChicks.com, right, wherever you find your exercise science reading, right? And if you find something that you think is relevant for starting straight coaches, you need to forward it to us and it will go into the hopper and we will consider it for inclusion in the readings. The starting straight site, all the articles that get published on the starting straight site are automatically candidates for inclusion in the readings. The biomedical and exercise science literature, if you come across stuff that looks good, even if it's an abstract, you know how somebody refers you to an abstract and you go to PubMed and you see an abstract and that looks really interesting. You may not be able to get the whole paper, right? But if you send us the citation, we'll get the whole paper and we'll review it and we'll consider it for inclusion. And this is actually a big gap in this year's reading. I didn't think of this until recently. One category that we should think about is the anthropology of strength, the history and culture of strength training. And so in the future, I think you can look to see some articles on that, right? That is important. This is the library map, and it's included in more detail towards the beginning of your handout. And this is how the starting strength coaches library will be organized along these sort of general large topic headings, and then each one of these large topic headings has a number of subheadings. And I show you this merely to show you how this year's article selections map out onto the library map. And you can see that we didn't plan it this way, right? We just ended up getting a really good range of articles. 3 articles in biomechanics, 6 articles in exercise physiology, 4 in what I call big medicine, 1 programming article, 2 articles in training, coaching, and performance, 1 sports med, 1 nutrition, substance, and drugs, and again, we're going to try to include this next year. Now, a lot of that is because some of these articles map onto more than one major topic area, right? So there's some doubling up there. But I'm kind of pleased that we ended up getting a good range of topics for you in the readings, and we'll try to do that in the future. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to read an exercise paper. There's a little article at the beginning of your handout on how to read an exercise science paper. Why is this in there? Well, in part because it was decided early on in conversations with Rip, these are Rip's pretty much exact words. A starting strength coach should know how to read an exercise science paper. That's pretty much a direct quote. And I have to say that I agree with that. The problem is that the exercise science literature, scientific literature in general, is intimidating to people, right? One of the reasons that it's intimidating to people is that it's poorly written. It's not, it's written by specialists for other specialists. It's written by specialists who can't write for other specialists who can't write. That's part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that people just have oh, that's a scientific paper. I'll read the abstract, I'll look at the conclusions, I'll look at the conclusions and swallow, right? I'll just decide that the conclusions are real, and you see that shit on the internet all the time. Once you learn that there is a way to approach, even as a layman, that there's a way to approach the scientific literature, and that you can get your head wrapped around it, and that you can get something out of looking at a scientific paper that is of interest and relevance to you, and lose the fear factor. It's kind of like swatting, right? You just got to lose the fear factor and get past that. A whole kind of world will open up to you. It's a world of mostly bullshit, but it's still a world that will open up to you, right? And it will enable you to be a better judge of what kind of papers you want to refer to us for review in the science review or for the annual readings. So I think this is a skill that professionals should have, right? The ability to look at the exercise science literature and get something out of it. So all this is a sort of a checklist, a sort of a paradigm, an approach, an algorithm. When you've got a scientific paper in your hands, how do you approach it? This is how I approach it. The first thing I look at is the title, right? And for review articles and commentaries, it's a little bit different. But for an original investigation, like a report of an experiment that somebody did, right? The title should say what they found, right? It shouldn't be something vague. It shouldn't be investigations of mTOR or something like that. And it sure as fuck shouldn't be a question, right? It should be a capsule of what the authors think they found, right? So if you're looking at a list of papers and you see that title, you should know what the authors think they discovered, what they think they proved, and that should tell you right off the bat whether the paper's even remotely of interest to you, right? The second thing you want to look at is the abstract, right? Which is all that most people look at. When you look at the abstract, and when you're done reading it, you should have a clear idea of what the purpose of the article was, right? What the hypothesis of the article was. There should be a hypothesis, a clearly testable hypothesis, right? People who squat more will get stronger. That's a hypothesis, right? It's a hypothesis that you can test. It's an experiment that you can do. It's something that you can measure. It's not like we hypothesize that God exists and wants us to drink more beer. That is not a hypothesis because you can't test it, all right? And you should have a pretty clear method of how they approach that problem experimentally. You should have a pretty clear idea of what, did they use rats, did they use people, did they use a crossover design, was there a control, what was the intervention that they did, what was the dependent variable, those kinds of things. You should be able to look at that and tell what they did. And you should have a good idea of what their findings and conclusions are, which is usually the least of the problems because that's what they want to tell you. They usually don't want to tell you this other shit because they usually didn't do that good of a job at it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Then, you've read the title. The title should tell you what they think they found. You've read the abstract, which is basically just a condensation of the whole paper. Now what do? You start reading the paper? No. What the next thing you do is you jump to the tables and to the figures. That's what you do. You go right to the data. You already have a vague and fuzzy idea of what the methods were. You already have a vague and fuzzy idea of what it was they were measuring. Now, go right to the data, right to the tables, right to the figures. Read the legends and try to make sense of them. Try to make sense of that data on your own before the authors have a chance to try to make sense of it for you, right? You look at the data before they tell you about it. You look at the data before they have a chance to wave their hands in your face and tell you what they think it means. Does that make sense? The data is what the paper is all about. Look at the data first, look at the data last, look at the data in the middle. You should look at the data at least twice during your reading of the paper, and 3 times is probably pretty good, right? If the data doesn't make sense to you, that's actually a red flag. It's not an indication that you're stupid. It's not an indication that you're dumb. You may be stupid, right? But that's not what the data is telling you. What the data is telling you is if you're looking at it and it doesn't make sense, maybe it just doesn't fucking make sense, right? And they're going to do a bunch of this and try and say, no, it really does make sense. You're stupid. Just listen to what we're saying, right? No, look at the data, and if it doesn't make sense, that is a red flag. For anybody, you're all smart people. You can look at data and you can tell whether it makes any sense. Look at the data and say, here's the control group, here's the experimental group. They went from here to here, and then there's these error bars that show how much variance there was in the data, and the data bars are this fucking long, right, on both groups. And you look at that data and you say, I'm not sure that's really different, right? You should hold on to that. You should hold on to that first impression. That's a question that should be in the back of your mind as you read the rest of the paper. So ask yourself these questions. Do they make sense, and are the results meaningful and relevant? Sometimes you'll look at the data and go, okay, that doesn't interest me. I don't see anything here that's interesting or relevant to me. It's time to move on to another paper. Now you can go and read the introduction, right? The introduction is often useful even if the data isn't, because in the introduction, the authors are going to tell you where the field is at and what the big questions are in the field and what the big debate is. You understand what I'm saying? They're going to give you an idea of where the field is at, and sometimes that'll end up being the most useful part of the whole paper. And if there's not a clearly stated hypothesis in the abstract, this is the place where the authors might be able to redeem themselves and give you a clearly stated hypothesis. We hypothesized that this, and so we did an experiment to prove that, right? If you still don't know after reading the introduction what the hypothesis of the paper is, you may have a piece of shit in your hands, and you should consider putting it down, right? Now, you look at the methods. This is where shit gets really boring. This is where shit gets really dry and where shit gets really hard. And this is the part of the paper where things may start to get a little bit out of your, or even a lot, out of your comfort zone or your area of expertise. This is not something that's unique to the layman, right? So if I'm reading a medical paper or an exercise science paper in a field that I'm not familiar with, I have to stretch. That paper may be my business. So I read cardiology papers all the time, right? I'm not a cardiologist, right? So I have to stretch my mind and understand what they're trying to tell me and ask myself, is that a gold standard assay in cardiology? Is that an accepted methodology in cardiology? What does that word even mean, right? Because even within medicine, there are sub-languages and subfields that have areas of expertise. So I have to read that paper, I have to know what that paper says because it's important, but I may not understand the methodology, I may not understand the assay, so I may have to do a little bit of homework, right? So that if the paper is really important to you, if it's really relevant, right? If you really need it to win an argument on the internet or something like that, right? If the paper is important and relevant to you, you may have to go outside the paper and do a little bit of research outside the paper about the assays and the methods that they used so that you can understand what they did, right? A lot of times you don't have to, but sometimes you do. One of the most important parts of the methods is the sample size analysis. So the sample size analysis is where the authors said, we wanted to have 80% power to detect a difference. Here's the problem. Here's the problem that you run into. If the study is too small, there are a couple of things that can happen. You may find a difference where one doesn't really exist in the population, just by chance, right? So let's say that you have a tub that's full of white stones and a couple of black stones. And you go in there and you pick out 5 stones, and you just happen to get one of the black stones. And then you say, well, this is the incidence of black stones in the tub, and you're completely off the fucking mark, right? Because your sample size was too small, right? Your sample size may also be too small to detect a difference where one exists. So if I'm testing a drug, and the effect of a drug, or an intervention like barbell training in a population, right? And I don't observe a difference, right? But I only had 5 people in each group. The immediate response from somebody reading that should be, well, your study wasn't adequately powered to detect a difference. So if I go into my barrel of white stones again, and I pull out 5 stones, and I don't get any black ones, and I say, there's no fucking black stones in this barrel. I should stop dropping so many F-bombs. I got a lot of complaints about that last time. There's no freaking black stones in the barrel, right? My study, taking 5 stones out of the barrel, did not have the power to make that determination, right? And if I have a lot of experience with barrels or full of stones, or there's a literature about barrels full of stones, and I kind of know what the effect sizes are for that phenomenon in general, right? Or if I can make a really good guess about it, what I can do is I can do a power analysis. There's ways that you don't have to worry how it's done. You just have to worry that it's done. There are ways to do a power analysis, say how big a sample do I need to detect a difference if a difference really exists? How big does my sample have to be to make sure that I don't make that type 2 error, the incorrect rejection of the null hypothesis? You understand what I'm saying? Now, so when you read an exercise science paper, you should look for that. And you won't find it because they never frickin' do it. And do you know why they never do it? Because all their studies are small and short. Even the best exercise science literature is too small and too short to be adequately powered. That's a little bit of a problem when they find a difference, especially a small difference. But it's an even bigger problem if they go in and they say there was no difference. In the vast majority of exercise science literature, when somebody tells me they didn't see a difference between 2 experimental conditions, I go, bullshit. Because you didn't give me a power analysis, I have no confidence that your study was large enough to detect a difference where a difference really exists. Does that make sense? It's a huge problem with our literature. You need to start thinking of this. This is our literature that I'm talking about, and it's messed up because nobody holds their feet to the fire. I know one guy who holds their feet to the fire, but they don't listen to me. Almost never found. All you have to do is look for the power analysis or the sample size analysis. Just look for it. Just look for did they do it? And if they didn't do it, boom, that's a red flag. And by now the paper's starting to accumulate red flags. All of them do. Now, look at the methods. The methods should be hypothesis driven. There should be a primary outcome. There should be a clearly stated hypothesis. This is especially important for clinical studies, for studies involving clinical subjects. If you're looking at a protein, or if you're looking at DNA binding or something like that, it becomes a little bit fuzzier. But when you're looking at a population of people and you're going in with an intervention like barbell training or a drug or a specific sprint protocol or a specific programming protocol, you need to have one primary outcome. And that primary outcome needs to be established before you do the experiment. It should be the primary outcome that is necessitated by the hypothesis. I hypothesize that if we make people do quarter squats, they'll be able to jump higher than people who do back squats. And so what's my primary outcome? Jumping higher, right? Because that was my hypothesis. My hypothesis is they'll be able to jump higher. That's my primary, and it's my only primary outcome. There's one primary outcome. I may measure some other shit, and what I may find is that there's no difference in my primary outcome, so I just report all that other shit that I found that was really interesting, but which the experiment wasn't really designed to do. You see that all the time. So you've got to look for that. This is explained in detail in the article, probably better than I'm explaining it now. Assays. So how did they measure their primary outcome or their secondary outcomes? How did they take their measurements, right? We talk about gold standard measurements, bronze standard measurements, shit standard measurements. What's really great is when they try to determine the outcome by measuring it against itself. You'll see what I mean if you read enough of these papers. And it's hard for you to know what the gold standard is. And in the exercise science literature, there are no gold standards. That's the problem, right? Sometimes it's reps at 60% bench press, right? 1 rep max. Sometimes it's 1 rep max. Sometimes it's mean rate of force development, right? And what they do is they measure all of these shit and they see which one is different. That's the wrong way to do science. That's exactly back-asswards. Always ask yourself, where's the control? What's the control group, right? Is it a crossover study where they had the athletes come back in a week and do the control or do the experimental conditioning, so they're using the same athletes? That's actually a powerful methodology. If I'm testing what happens when athletes take caffeine, a caffeinated beverage, I should have another beverage, right, that tastes just like the caffeinated beverage and has the same volume and is hot and delicious, just like a caffeinated beverage. Right? It should be the same thing except for that one experimental intervention. Everything else should be as identical as they can make it between the two groups, right? Right down to, if you can do a case crossover, you're using the same athlete in 2 different conditions. That's really a powerful methodology. But always ask yourself, where's the control? Because sometimes the answer will be, I don't see a control, right? Or I see a really poor control. Blinding. The investigators, if at all possible, should be assayed or should be blinded to the group allocation. So if I have 2 experimental groups, right, and I assign one to the experimental condition and I assign one to the control condition, I do the experiment, I do the intervention, I take my samples, say muscle biopsies. They love their frickin' muscle needle biopsies, right? Boom, they take a muscle biopsy and then they take it to the lab and they freeze it and then they take it and they slice it up and then they stain it and then they count type 2 fibers and type 1 fibers and, right, they do all that. Well, if the investigator counting the fibers knows which group that muscle biopsy came from, right, consciously or not, that is a source of bias. He's going to tend to undercount or overcount. And that's actually been studied scientifically itself. We know that people do that. Even there's I'm not invested in these results at all. I'm not biased, right? They're totally biased. That's actually been studied. You are totally biased when you do that. Investigators need to be blinded, and they should tell you how they did the blinding, if at all possible. Statistical analysis, this is where all the evil shit happens, right, in statistical analysis. Anybody ever heard of the book, the classic book, it's actually in your bibliography, How to Lie with Statistics, right? How to Lie with Statistics. It's important to understand, many scientists think that statistics is how they are going to justify the data. They're going to say, look, yeah, these 2 groups, they look almost the same, but there's a statistically significant difference between them. P is less than 0.05. So with statistics, we have proven that this minuscule difference between the groups, it's really real, right? That is not the point of statistics. The point of statistics is to describe the distribution of the data. It's just to describe, to give you a description of the data and to give you an idea of the probability that the difference that you observed is due to chance alone. That's all the statistics is for. That's all statistics does. It doesn't justify the data in any way. If I do an experiment on 2 groups and they're like this, and the difference is statistically significant, I don't give a shit if it's statistically significant because it's practically insignificant. If I do an experiment and the 2 groups are like this, but it's not statistically significant, I don't care because, wow, damn, right? That's a huge difference. You have to convince me that that's not practically significant. Does that make sense? This is what they do. Statistical significance does not equal practical significance. That's the take-home point. And then finally, the results. Read the results section and look at the results as the figures in the tables as the authors discuss them, right? And see if they still make sense to you or if they make more sense to you. Here's the big problem, not just in the exercise science literature, but in all kinds of investigative literature. When you have a large data set, right, or when you're looking at something like proteins sometime, things like that, you have a lot of individual subjects in your experiment. You have to report your results in aggregate. You understand what I mean? You have to show you got a big population, and you need something like this bar graph here, right? But that's not most of the exercise science literature. Most of the exercise science literature is like, we took 10 bros, we put 5 of them in an experimental group, and we put 5 of them in a control group, and then we had them do this, and then we did a muscle biopsy. That's the exercise science literature, right? You don't need to present your results in aggregate, but they do anyway. So here's an experiment that that's the experiment, right? I took 10 bros, and I put 5 of them in a control group, and I put 5 of them in an experimental group, and the guys in the experimental group got Sully Dog's power and mass extreme or whatever, right? And then I measured a bunch of shit, and I looked for the bunch of shit that was different, right? So I measured their 1 rep max, and I measured reps to volitional exhaustion at 60% of 1 rep max on the bench press, and I measured their counter movement jump and their penile length and their political affiliation, all that stuff. And then I found something that was different. What was different was 60% 1 rep max, reps to volitional exhaustion. That's different. It was more. It was more in those guys in aggregate. And so that's the data that I present. There it is. It looks pretty impressive. But if I present the data properly by showing you what happened to each individual subject in the experiment, it tells a totally different, this is exactly the same data. Exactly the same data. But it tells you what happened to each individual subject in the experiment. And when you look at this data, what you see is that all the increase in the SPAM X group was due to these two individuals, right? Probably on steroids. And that the only guy who got weaker was in the experimental group, this guy right here. Totally different story, right? It tells a totally different story. And so when I ask, why don't they ever do it this way? I think I've just answered my own question, right? Finally, look at the discussion. So the discussion is where the authors try to like spin their results and put things in the best possible light and tell you how relevant and important their results are and how all this work that they've done is really going to change the world. And there's also often a lot of good information. It's often a really nice review of the field, kind of like the introduction. So if the paper's at all relevant to you, you should read it. And then finally, the conclusions. It is astonishing to the extent that people will have data. You'll look at the data and you'll say, that data tells me that X equals Y. And then the authors will conclude, we conclude that X does not equal Y based on this data and our statistical analysis and what other people have found. So we got this data and it shows that X equals Y, but we actually conclude that X does not equal Y. Right? But that is what will be presented in their abstract. Right? And that's what the bros will read when they go and they look at the abstract and they'll say, yeah, these guys concluded that X does not equal Y. But if you actually go and look at the paper, you'll see that what the data showed was that X equals Y. People will reach conclusions that are directly contradicted by their own data. We see it all the time. All you have to do is go and look, and you'll see that. You have to ask yourself, based on your reading of the paper, do the conclusions flow naturally from the data? Sometimes it's not that the data contradicts the conclusions contradict the data. Sometimes it's that they're getting too dreamy on you, right? So they did an experiment in rats and they looked at a protein in rats, and from there they concluded that everybody should do jumping squats, right? There's no way that you can do an animal experiment, right? Or an experiment under very specific conditions and make a conclusion about human programming. People do that all the time. The conclusions are constrained by the experimental conditions and the actual data that the authors obtained. If you do an experiment in rats, your conclusion, somewhere in your conclusions, you should say, in rats, right? If you did an experiment in older, healthy people, somewhere in your conclusions it should say, in older, healthy people. Make sense? All of this is common sense, right? Which just goes to show that you're smarter than the people who write this shit, right? You have common sense. You can look at this data. Keep this here. It's going to be part of the coaching library, and go out and find some scientific papers, use this approach, and see if it doesn't work. And see if the literature doesn't make a little bit more sense to you, or if you don't detect a lot of bullshit. Both things will happen. Please give it a try. A starting strength coach should be able to read the exercise science literature. I'm probably coming up on my first time point, aren't I? Let's take a break, and then we'll go through the papers really quick.